Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Museum of the City of New York. My name is Stephen Vider. I'm a Mellon postdoctoral fellow here and the curator of AIDS at Home, Art and Everyday Activism. Tonight, we are thrilled to have these three amazing authors, David France, Anne-Christine Daae, and Tim Murphy, for a discussion with journalist Mathew Rodriguez. Our four panelists tonight are going to all speak about their work writing about HIV and AIDS. Their respective books, Anne-Christine Daae's The Pox Lover, David France, How to Survive a Plague, and Tim Murphy, Christadora, tell stories and raise questions that resonate deeply with the themes of AIDS at Home, about home, family, and community, and what advocacy looks like. Writing in different genres, memoir, nonfiction, and fiction, each of our panelists tonight provides a new, yet always deeply personal perspective on how New Yorkers and those around the world have worked to innovate new forms of support, create new kinds of family, fight social stigma, and push for greater political and medical intervention. Following the program, I hope you'll join us in the back of the room for a drink and to purchase any of these books and to speak more with the authors. I just want to also mention two upcoming events coming up. One, the next event connected to AIDS at Home is next Thursday, off-site we're co-presenting it with Electronics Arts Intermix called Home Video, Media Art in Response to HIV and AIDS. As you'll see in the exhibition, I hope you'll come back to see the exhibition more, but the exhibition uses a lot of archival video to really open up ideas about what does AIDS look like at home, both in the past and present. And so we sort of riff on that for this upcoming event, Home Video. And you can find out more information about that on our website. We also hope to see you back here on Tuesday, August 1st, right here at the museum, for a screening of the film Metropolitan Avenue, a documentary that tells a story about a group of women who combined old values with new roles to save their Brooklyn neighborhood from the threat of development. Afterwards, there'll be a panel discussion with Jessica Green, cinema director at the Maysles Documentary Center, with journalists, activists from the film, and the director and producer of Metropolitan Avenue. And that event is in conjunction with our film series, Smile, It's Your Close-Up. We'd also like to thank tonight our promotional partners for this evening, including Visual AIDS, the Village Alliance, the Lederer Foundation, PEN America, the New York Public Library, Housing Works, the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, and the Center for Fiction. We really, truly appreciate their support. I'd now like to introduce our speakers tonight. David France is an author, filmmaker, and contributing editor for New York Magazine. His documentary film, How to Survive a Plague, was an Oscar finalist, won a Directors Guild Award and a Peabody Award, and was nominated for 2 Emmys. His book, based on the film, How to Survive a Plague, the inside story of how citizens and science tamed AIDS, which came out last year, provides a vivid and intimate account of how the activist group ACT UP both fought and worked with the medical establishment to make possible more effective treatments for HIV. Anne-Christine Daae is an investigative journalist and documentary filmmaker who reported on the global AIDS epidemic for New York Native, Out, The Nation, and The Village Voice. Her new book, just out last month, The Pox Lover, provides a personal history of her years in ACT UP and other activist groups like Lesbian Avengers in New York and Paris to reveal the global dimensions of HIV/AIDS and HIV/AIDS activism. Tim Murphy has reported on HIV/AIDS for 20 years for such publications as Pause Magazine, where he was an editor and staff writer, Out, Advocate, and New York Magazine. He also covers LGBTQ issues, arts, pop culture, travel, and fashion for outlets including New York Times Magazine, Condé Nast Traveler, and Details. His novel, Christadora, published last year, dashes back and forth in time from the 1980s into the future to retell the story of HIV/AIDS and the city through a rich cast of New Yorkers and the families they make. Our moderator, Mathew Rodriguez, is a queer Latino journalist, essayist, and activist. He is currently a staff writer for Into, and was previously a staff writer at Mike and a community editor for TheBody.com. He is currently working on a memoir about his father, HIV, and heroin on New York City's Lower East Side. To start our program, each of our three authors will read a brief excerpt from their new books, starting with David, then Anne-Christine, and finally Tim. And that will be followed by a conversation moderated by Mathew, and then there'll be time at the end for an audience Q&A. Please join me in welcoming our panel. Thank you.
Does this light work? No. I can't quite see. Paranoid Fantasies, 1984. Bobby Campbell and his message of patient empowerment were in great demand, leading to urgent invitations for him to address people with AIDS in New Orleans, Miami, Atlanta, Washington, Seattle, Dallas, Los Angeles. He appeared on Nightline, the late-night ABC news program, and on Phil Donahue's show. On June 28, he was in New York to give one of his inspirational talks and to attend the 15th annual Gay Pride March, reuniting with people with AIDS leaders from around the nation. On that weekend, he fulfilled his biggest dream, formally incorporating the National Association of PWAs to further the work begun in Denver the year before. Campbell returned home in time for the Democratic National Convention, which opened in San Francisco, July 15th. On a gusty afternoon, he stood on a stage across from the Moscone Center with his lover at his side, delivering a well-paced and strident keynote speech to 100,000 protesters. He looked fragile and tired, but his connection to the crowd was electric, and his voice was strong, echoing across the sea of heads. "I have a message for the nation," he said. "Very often lesbians and gay men are portrayed as isolated, as alienated and alone, or else in pathetic search of desperate sexuality. That's not true. And I think it's important for people to understand that lesbians and gay men do not exist outside of a context. And the context is the people we love and those that love us." As the crowd roared, he and Bob Hilliard embraced and kissed. "I have a message to the person with AIDS who may be in Des Moines or Indianapolis or Queens or elsewhere. Keep the faith, baby. I love you." Campbell cemented his place as the preeminent infected militant that day, but his whirlwind efforts took a toll on him. A few days later, a nasty case of shingles engulfed his head, leaving behind a field of deep scars. And in a few weeks, he entered the hospital with a brainstem overrun with cryptococcal meningitis, a horrifyingly painful experience. When the news reached New York City, Michael Callan bought a card to cheer him up, with a photo of the performer Divine in a nurse's uniform, menacingly hoisting an enema bag. "How many of this card have you gotten? It's just so you," he wrote. "Get well, that's an order." But Campbell never saw the note. Bob Hilliard watched helplessly as the blood pressure monitor fell from 100 to 50, then 40, then 0. Instinctively, he allowed the medical staff space to gently remove all the hoses and pipes and devices from Campbell's spent body. He was 32 years old. About a week after his massive memorial service, which failed to garner any coverage in the East Coast media, a large envelope from Bob Hilliard arrived at the New York native offices where I worked. Inside, he'd written a note. "Bobby Campbell died yesterday, August 15th, of AIDS-related meningitis at San Francisco General Hospital." This is how we received the awful news. In the course of my reporting, I had spoken to Campbell on the telephone, but we had never met. I still kept his famous Newsweek cover where he posed with his lover, and it had given me so much affirmation. Reading Hilliard's note, I wept angrily. Hilliard went on to say, "The enclosed was found among his papers, stamped and sealed. It seems clear to us that Bobby intended the letter to be sent, so we are forwarding it to you for publication. Thank you for complying with what was surely among his final wishes." I carefully smoothed Campbell's last communique onto my desktop. It was not a farewell. It carried no hint of the opportunistic infection he was fighting. Instead, it was a letter sent to the editor addressing the article that I had written about the bathhouse battle. In his quiet voice and with gentle optimism, he warned against moral absolutism on either side. AIDS partisans are neither traitors, nor murderers, nor heroes, he wrote, level-headed to the end. My hands trembled as I sat at the enormous photo offset machine and put his last public words into crisp columns of type. How to Survive a Plague.
Thanks, David. Try that again. Thank you, David.
That's the light.
Is it working?
Your mic's working.
I'm like, oh, you see? That's what happens when you're a Luddite. I'm just going to say on behalf of everybody in here that I'm really glad that David is here and that he wrote his book because he allowed me to remember my 80s, which I just remembered in reading his book. And it blew me away that we were in so many events, including newsrooms together from the New York Native on. And it's just a wild trip to have somebody else write a story in which you were there and you lived it and you reported and everything, and yet you're seeing it through somebody else's eyes, which lets you see yourself. So thank you, because we can't remember our own history, of course, but it was very deeply moving for me. Thank you. So The Pox Lover just came out, and this wasn't really intended to be a book. The Pox Lover is really my actual diaries, which were written. I started writing or keeping diaries, like many people, intermittently in the 80s. This particular book covers about 1992 to 1998. And in many ways, this book represents kind of research notes that I was taking as I was reporting. I was reporting on the AIDS epidemic from the 80s on. I was an editor at Out magazine for much of this period of time, and also getting more and more involved in activism. But I'm saying that because I think that there's a difference between writing a memoir or a history the way that David did, or writing a story about a period like Tim has done, versus the diaries that I wrote, which were in real time. And so later we can talk about that in terms of the difference of how one lives one's history. I didn't remember my own history as I went to edit these. So I think it's wonderful that we're here today, and I really wanted to thank the Museum of the City of New York for the opportunity. I'm going to read a very short piece here about this image. I think this is taking place in 1992, maybe early into 1993. It takes place in New York. I've been home a few weeks, and I'm still unpacking and reviewing everything that's happened here while I was gone. I still haven't read through all the AIDS conference abstracts. There's a lot there. It's been so busy at the magazine, too. My Berlin travel piece is done. That was fun to write, to remember being there. I'll send it to Philippe, which reminds me that I have a follow-up with CCR, the Center for Constitutional Rights, about the Haiti case. They probably want me to go back to Haiti for more interviews, but I can't go right now. I actually have a full-time job now. Maybe early next year. I just looked back at my calendar. I can't believe how intense the year has been already. Since January, the Avengers, side notes, the lesbian Avengers, have had what feels like nonstop actions and street zaps every month. I loved our Bryant Park Valentine's Day action where we reunited Gertrude Stein's statue with her lover, Alice Toklas. Lesbian waltzing, it was great. I wasn't so good at it. There's so much fun creativity in the Avengers, so much play. And then the Dyke March, so amazing. I can't even write more about it here because there's just too much to say. But 20,000 women from everywhere in East Jesus. When we started organizing it, we really didn't know who'd show up. Clearly, lesbians have just been waiting for someone to throw big street girl protest parties. I was happy a lot of the boys came to cheer us on, too. Robert Hilferty wants to be an Avenger pretty bad. Next year, we're going to do the Dyke March here, and I bet it's going to be a big deal, too. Plus, we got a Newsweek article that really put us on the map. So a lot of people know about us. Even before the DC March, we kept hearing about new groups, and now it's like mushrooms popping up in all these little corners of the country. Some of us are just one or two girls, but they're an Avenger chapter. It's fantastic. I don't think we ever anticipated this much success, even if we dreamed of it. I mean, maybe Sarah Schulman and Anna Simo did. They always have grand visions for lesbians, but I think we're all pretty happily surprised. I'd like to go hang with the Austin Avengers. They seem like a really fun group. Fierce ladies. Plus two-stepping. That could be fun to learn. Probably easier than waltzing. And I like the idea of wearing boots and spurs. It takes me back to my childhood. I lived in cowboy boots when I was 5. I'll probably go north first if I go anywhere with the Avengers. Anna Simo and some New York Avengers went to Tampa earlier this year, and I couldn't. It's one of the places where anti-gay violence is up, some of it linked to Christian activist groups. The same thing is happening in all these places, including Maine and Colorado. They have neo-Nazi groups there. Scary guys. There's been a boycott of Colorado over anti-gay Amendment 2. There, the Colorado Avengers have gotten some good press for their actions. Some of them chained themselves up to the gates of the governor's mansion, and I think they were even planning to chain themselves to the governor himself until they realized that might be really serious, like attacking a police officer or something. Real jail time. Certainly sounded rad. I wonder if they ate fire. I want to see the demo pics. Now there's Maine. A local group, Equal Protection Lewiston, has asked for help, and the Avengers are already up there. There's a gay rights ordinance that's under attack. I think the anti-gay group Focus on the Family is putting their money behind the attack like they have in Colorado. We need to think about how to go after their leader. He's such a homophobe. The group has so much money. Anyway, Maine. I want to go there and hope Jersey will come. Road trip. Before I finish this roundup, I want to mention what ACT UP has done this year, too. I feel like I go to meetings every week, and I still miss things that people do. There's just so much. And so many affinity groups, and now we're in so many cities, too. This year started with the Hoffman-LaRoche action by the Treatment Action Committee. It was a great, successful action. Then a bunch of fact-zaps and actions against Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority and the Christian Right. ACT UP has been involved in Colorado around Amendment 2, and then all the immigration work before and after Berlin around Guantanamo. The Haitians who were brought here have been resettled. It's so impressive. Housing Works with Charles King is on fire. Well, okay, we did lose on HIV immigration policy. Clinton said he wants to lift it, and said he's kept it there. There's a failure to move ahead, no question about that. But we still have had a lot of victories. A huge one is the trifecta around women's HIV issues. The female condom got approved, cervical cancer got added to the definition of AIDS after our fighting about this for so long, and the first women's interagency HIV study called WISE is about to start with some great feminist research docs in charge. I met some of them in DC when we had a meeting with health officials over HIV issues for lesbians. It's really interesting research, and I'm going to keep track of the project as it develops. We're going to learn a lot about the disease and meds in women, especially black women and women with histories of domestic abuse and IV drug use. These are some of the categories. So kudos to the women in ACT UP and the research docs. Chapeau, as we say in Haiti, hats off. There's been other good news, too. Our pal Tony Kushner, who's an amazing writer, got a Pulitzer for Angels in America, which everyone says is wild and great, and I can't wait to see. I bet it's going to open so many eyes and hearts. At least I hope so. Tony's famous now. It's so well-deserved. He's such a mensch, too. I almost forgot. Waco happened. That crazy clash between the Branch Davidian sects and the FBI. That's been so dramatic. Wacko Waco. Really, it's been an intense year, and it's not even over. We're still fighting the school board over the rainbow curriculum. It's already got so badly gutted since our Queens Avenger action, and now the city is pushing abstinence, which is insanity in this epidemic. So we really can't rest on any of our laurels. Plus St. Pat's. I forgot to mention that. We still can't freely march and spill our queer green beer with the Irish drunks in that damn parade. I'm sure Ilgo and the Avengers will come up with a good action for us to do my march. Dancing lesbian leprechauns? I can see it already. Maybe Alden will join us. He does such a good Irish brogue. Plus his nice legs in green tights. It'd be magically delicious, like in a Lucky Charms ad.
Hi, everyone. I just want to nod to these two books as well, which I read recently and very recently, and I learned so many facets of activism in the 90s that were kind of dusty memories. The Lesbian Avengers and lesbian visibility and the emergence of ACT UP in Paris And it's such a fun read. It is so full of parties and struggle, but parties and life, and it's very sexy. There's a lot of dyke romantic drama. In the book. Not surprising if you know this one. And with David's book, what really struck me was that I really felt that after more than 20 years covering this, there wasn't a lot in the treatment narrative that I didn't know. And I just learned reams in your book. And what's so amazing about his book is that it almost feels like it's so granular. I felt like I was reading the epidemic in real time, like almost week to week. And that was, for someone who was 11 in 1981 and wasn't really looking at this epidemic up close until about a decade later, that was really stunning. And there were just things that I learned that I didn't know that infuriated me about the recalcitrance of Fauci and the federal agencies. And just so much. It's just an extraordinary book. And if you're just kind of an AIDS addict and you just can't get enough, then you might finally have gotten enough by the time you finish this book. So this Christador is a novel, and as Stephen said, and I also want to just shout out that I just saw the exhibition upstairs, and it is so beautiful, and it really put me so deeply in the period of this very book, and a lot of the images in the exhibition were the very images that I would just find online, and I would sort of just pore over them and ponder them as I wrote the book to try to get when I was writing a section like this section I'm going to read in the summer of 1989, I would just look at images and read clips from that summer just to really fix myself in that moment. And the exhibition is really just beautiful and moving if you haven't seen it. So this little piece I'm going to read right here does take place in the early summer of 1989, which I am very moved by this period because this seemed to me, in retrospect and research, like a moment of tremendous optimism, an up moment for activists. ACT UP had really found its stride and it had a giant presence at the international conference in Montreal, right? That just the month before, and they had really made traction in getting the way the trials were structured bent to their will, and a second drug was coming online, and it just felt like a spring and an early summer of optimism. And of course, there were so many. The worst really was yet to come in many ways. So this does take place in an ACT UP meeting, but this takes place a little bit after. And a young woman named Isabel Mendez, who this is 1989, and she's been living with HIV secretly for a few years. She's a young woman from a Dominican family in Queens. And so she's been kind of living in secrecy and shame for several years. And she finally creeps her way to a meeting, which I never call it ACT UP because I wanted a little leeway in terms of, the micro facts. But essentially that's where she's going. And she's gone to her first meeting, and she's going out after with some of the activists, including one named Hector Villanueva, who's a really very influential treatment activist within the movement, very respected. So the rain had already pooled so deeply off the curb that Issy was about to step into it in her sandal up to her ankle when Ricky, that's Hector's boyfriend, his bag of flyers already wet, went, "Whoa, girl," and sort of lifted her from the waist so she missed the big puddle. They were leaving a diner where they'd gone to eat after the big meeting. Her, Hector, this guy Ricky, who was obviously his boyfriend, and a guy named Corey, who really didn't look good. She had stood alongside Hector throughout the rambunctious meeting, a bit overwhelmed and dazed, but also strangely relieved and feeling safe. And then when it adjourned, Hector, and she could tell that Hector was a big shot here, had introduced her to a bunch of women, some of them Latinas, but most of them looking like lesbianas. And before she knew it, she was on a committee to try to get the federal definition of AIDS expanded to include more symptoms that only women had. Like not getting your periods regularly. That had been happening to her. And after Hector had said, "Come on, we're getting something to eat at Joe Jr., come with us." So she had, sitting there with a bowl of tomato soup and a grilled cheese, while the guys talked mainly about a Chinese drug and whether you could take it for AIDS or not, because Corey wanted to know. Overall, Hector didn't think it was a good idea. "I think you should wait and get into parallel tracking with DDI," he told Corey, who took a deep breath as though he were digesting this new idea. Everyone had been talking about this new drug, DDI, at the meeting, Issy had noticed. Could this be the drug that was going to change everything? What if she lived? She sipped her soup and listened quietly to Hector and Corey go back and forth. There was a lot of new terminology she was learning tonight. Some folks had told her they didn't know jack shit about AIDS or science or the body or anything before they started coming to the meetings. And now, only a few months in, they could hold their own, read medical papers, follow a conversation. Maybe that would happen to her, too. She already had dental knowledge. And at her dental hygienist job, she suffered intense guilt that she had told no colleague she was infected, as well as terror that someone might find out and she'd be fired, or worse, that she might somehow bleed into a patient's mouth and infect them. Ricky put his arm around her. She knew he was in his 20s, but he looked like he could be 12 with that little boy face. "How's your soup and sandwich, girl?" he asked her. She laughed. "It's fine. I didn't eat much today before. I was nervous about coming to the meeting." "Well, you came and you made a splash," he said. She liked Ricky. He reminded her of when you were flipping TV channels and came across an old musical set on a farm or something, that kind of guy. All American and smiley and wholesome, even though he had a punk haircut. The boys were getting up now and talking about going to dance at a bar called Boy Bar. She didn't think she'd ever been there with Tavi. Maybe it was new. "What are you going to do now?" Ricky asked her. She shrugged. "I guess I'm going to take the subway back to Queens." God, it was so stressful living with her family, hiding this from them. What if she started looking like Corey? How would she hide it then? "Come dance with us," Ricky said. She laughed. "Me? No, you guys, go ahead." Corey put his arm around her. "Oh, honey, please. If I can go for a while, so can you." She looked up at Hector. "Come out with us for a while, chica," he said. The place was basically a dark pit with loud music, like Paradise Garage had been. Tavi, she thought when she walked in, the music's throb hitting her. They were walking forward in a crowd of guys, and she felt herself shuffling, her hand rising to her neck. Oh, she had pushed down these feelings about Tavi. Oh, God, he had been like her brother, far more than her real brother. Well, maybe he was more like her sister. And she couldn't bring herself to tell him in his final months when he was so sick that she had the same thing. He died without knowing. She'd pushed down all this Tavi stuff for months now. She hadn't set foot in a club, heard this thump-thump music since Tavi. Hector spied her, put a hand on her neck. "You okay?" he shouted in her ear. "I haven't been to a club since Tavi," she shouted back into his ear on her tippy toes. He put his arm around her. "It's too much for you? I can walk you out." She didn't share that she'd barely stepped into a club since that night 5 years ago, the night she was fairly certain she'd gotten the virus from that Moreno in the back of the car. 4 years later, she'd started having the private area problems, catching colds that seemed never to go away, noticing her glands were always hard and swollen. The doctor she'd visited asked her if she had any reason to believe she might have HIV. She didn't have to think back too hard. Literally, from the week after the encounter with the Moreno, she'd wondered if she'd done a stupid thing, especially as she read more and more about the disease. She'd insisted on a condom the 2 times she'd had sex with someone since. "I had sex once with a bisexual guy," she told the doctor, "without a condom." The 2 weeks she waited for the test results, she stopped into church every day to light a candle and pray she didn't have it. When the doctor called her back in and told her that she did, in fact, have it, she felt an immediate disgust with herself for being so naive and trusting as to think God would have cut her a break. What a fool she was. She wasn't getting a thing she wanted out of life. The deck was stacked against her, and this was fate's last laugh at the sad, not much life of Isabel Mendez. That sense she'd long buried, that perhaps the world really wasn't a fair and good place as dictated by the church, came rushing up in a hot, humiliating blaze in her throat. "So I'm going to get more sick and die?" she asked the doctor, tears welling in her eyes. And meanwhile, she calculated to herself, she'd be fired from her job and would have to endure the scorn and rejection of her family, the neighborhood. That would be fun. "How much time do I have?" "Don't look at it that way," the doctor said. "You're in decent health now. Your T cells are high. We'll monitor you, and if they ever get really low, we can talk about AZT." "What?" "It's a drug for HIV. "Does it cure it?" "No, but it can keep it in check for a while. And other drugs will be coming down the pike. So meanwhile, eat well, don't drink or smoke, exercise, don't get too stressed. You'll be okay." Taking out her anger at a cheap gym after work was Issy's concession to the doctor's advice. Otherwise, she suppressed the diagnosis, pushed it down inside herself. If the doctor said she didn't have to worry about it, she wouldn't. And she wouldn't tell anyone either. But life became very stressful, and she found herself constantly short-tempered or breaking out privately into tears. She felt as though she may as well be walking around wearing a sign that said, "I have AIDS." She feared that if her brother ever found out that she knew all along she had the virus after she'd held and played with her little niece, he'd turn on her in a rage. Then, a few months before, she'd started noticing in the papers and on the news that there was a group, mostly gay guys, who were out there blocking traffic and getting arrested, demanding that the city and the country do more to stop the disease. She followed them with a secret thrill. They weren't afraid if anyone thought they had the disease or not. They were all over the papers. It had all led to her creeping to the meeting tonight into a feeling of colossal relief. So now, the music stealing up into her feet, she let herself collapse in Hector's arms a little bit. "No, I'm okay," she told Hector. "I want to dance a little." And I'll stop there.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Give one more round of applause for everyone who read As Stephen had said, my name is Mathew Rodriguez, and I am right now a staff writer at Into, which is a new LGBTQ magazine that's going to launch on August 10th. So shameless plug for that. Yeah, so I'm just here to moderate a conversation. So I can be a little hands-on as a moderator, but I'll step in. But yeah. Oh, also just want to remind everyone there is going to be a short Q&A at the end. So if you have a question, write it down ahead of time, keep it succinct, and we can try and get as many people to ask their questions as possible. Okay, so in talking about these three authors and these three books, one of the things that I wanted to bring up first was that they're all obviously from different genres, and I wanted to talk about genre and what brought you to writing in this genre. So we have fiction, we have two kinds of nonfiction, one memoir and one more, one less memoir. Let's say, I don't know how to say that. I don't know. So there's three different types. So what made you choose your genre? What were the tools that genre offered you, and what were the limitations that you felt from it in writing about HIV specifically? You can, whoever wants to go first.
Well, I'll say that I think of mine as a witness account, in the tradition of witness accounts. And I had spent some time wondering why no one had gone back to do that big kind of sweeping story of the plague years in America. And I realized that it took many years for those books to appear after other kind of mass death experiences. And the books that were most telling for me from the Holocaust, for example, were witness account books. And I had been writing and researching this book for a long time before it occurred to me that I had an obligation to tell the reader who was witnessing it. And that's why I put my own story in. It's not something I've ever done before, and not something I'm particularly comfortable with, but I felt that it made sense to explain that this was the world as it was seen by a specific person. So for me, it was the first attempt at a kind of a hybrid writing.
Oh, okay. Well, I was actually a novelist before I was a journalist. In my 20s, I published 2 novels, and I was doing 2 kinds of writing to support myself. I was doing ad copywriting for books, mostly. This is in the when there were still book clubs. And I was also doing, and actually I started on a volunteer basis doing AIDS writing because I wanted to push past my fear of the epidemic. I was very young. I was in my early 20s. It was the early 90s, and I was very afraid of it moving here, and I wanted to push past my fear about it and understand it. And so that's how I started AIDS writing. And then I sort of had a flip, like around when I was 30, I flipped, and instead of going, mostly writing fiction with like a little journalism on the side, I flipped. And I started working at Pause Magazine as a staffer. and then worked at places after that, other than that, for about a decade. And then around that time, I just felt like I had lost something, like fiction writing, I had lost something that was very important to me. And I should try to get it back. But I didn't have a fixed, I certainly didn't think, I'm going to try to write a novel that's the whole sweep of the AIDS story in New York. I actually started with, I just wrote a chapter. I just wrote really a short story, a chapter which is pretty much the first chapter of the book. Mm-hmm. And then the whole story grew out of that, with the tentacles going back in time, because that chapter takes place right around 9/11, with the tentacles going back in time. And so it actually really just evolved, that whole sweep kind of evolved very organically. And I think that, for me, having been a journalist for 10 years prior, how it really changed my fiction was that in journalism, your poetry is really the first thing to go. When they need to cut, 500 or 1,000 words, the section that you think is just the most beautiful and the cat's meow is just the first thing to go, And I think that really affected the writing of the book, because I wasn't really trying overly hard to write absolutely knock you out with gorgeous prose. I wanted to just immerse you in a very cinematic way in the story, and make it very vivid and visual, and have it move, and to not really overly call attention to the writing itself. So.
But I should add that the writing is beautiful. It's just over the top beautiful. And the other thing that you accomplished in that book, which you can't do anywhere in journalism, and I've never seen done in nonfiction, and rarely done before, is you devised a structure for this story that gave it this hugeness that was just amazing, to be able to follow your story chapter to chapter, as you were saying, into the future, into the past, was remarkable, and really, I commend you for it.
Oh, thanks, David. It's nice to hear.
So let's see. Well, I think I mentioned that. First of all, I wasn't thinking about The Pox Lover itself as a book. I had another book in my mind that I was writing the entire time that I was writing the notes for it. So The Pox Lover is kind of the research notes for another book that, in fact, mostly does exist. And I was actually trying to intentionally report or document these different lines of inquiry at the time for a possible book. And it was my preoccupation with the rise of the right wing in France, actually, that I started to follow. And but I wasn't ready to write the fiction, so I thought, well, let me just take notes, kind of. And so I was already keeping a diary, so it was a more intentional diary that I kept. Kind of a working diary of my life and my research. And what I realized at a certain point was around, I guess, when I started to look at it at a certain point, was that reality, daily reality, kept trumping me. I was trying to write a story that would talk to people about my fear of the return of fascism to France. And I was tracking the right wing and Le Pen and stuff in my actual research and notes and trying to write about this. And even my most fantastical ideas for the novel would suddenly start to come true. And I was like, oh, shit. What am I going to do? I can't be the Cassandra here. What am I going to do with this? And also, there were French reporters and writers who were there who were doing a much better job at reporting. So I was struggled for a while about what is this thing. And but I had particularly, as people know when they read this book, I had been invaded. I had an invasion of a voice in my head, an internal muse that was present for the entire decade for me. And I was following that. And what happened for me really with this book was probably my deepest writer's journey, where at a certain point you're in it and you just decide you have to just go for it. And you at least are going to follow your own rabbit holes. And for me, that was a decision at a certain point, because I felt that reality was exceeding my imagination, as it is right now, I think, with Trump in some ways. Truly. So in about 2009 or 10, when I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with what I considered to be an incredible mess, which was, a 3,000 pages of something, of a journey, luckily colleagues of mine, mercifully editors, read it and said, we love this fiction, which isn't quite done, but what we really like is this journey that you took, because this is our journey as writers and as this, as activists. And so it was really they're pushing me to say, this is our story. It's your story, but this is kind of our story. And so that's how I ended up deciding to publish The Pox Lover and write a prologue and an epilogue to frame it. But it was not my first thought. So.
Well, one of the things that strikes me about all of the works, and especially Cristodora and Pox Lover, are that setting plays such a huge role in the telling of the story, and that when I think about the HIV epidemic, it's that there's many epidemics, and often that they are colored by the geographical location where they happen. So yours is about, on the front cover is a building on the Lower East Side, and yours, the Eiffel Tower, is on the front cover. It's about Paris, and then obviously how Starved Plague takes place in a lot of different places. It shifts locus a lot, but a lot of it is in New York and LA. And so I'm just wondering, how did where the story took place shape the story for you? You want to say something? Your face lit up like it was Christmas.
Yeah, I don't know.
But you weren't even going to do Cristodora first, right? At first, you were thinking I picked.
Well,
you,
no,
right?
actually, when I started writing it, I pictured it taking place in, because maybe half the characters live in the same building, or at least when the book starts, they do. And it was a friend's building, and it's very similar to the Cristodora. And it's in the East Village, and it's an old building, with a doorman. So there's that whole sense of a doorman that's always watching. The building's always watching you, and kind of connecting the dots, between the different people in the building. And then I think, as some of you probably know, the Cristodora building in the East Village has this very special history, and it reflects the history of the city in the past throughout the 20th century, because it kind of started on a great notion, housing for the working middle class, and the reform movement, et cetera. And then the building just sort of sank into total dereliction, so much of the neighborhood in the city. And I always forget if the city sold it or the city bought it for $60,000 in 1975. I don't know. Could you have more of a statement about how downgraded this city was and how absurdly wealthy it has become since? So that whole cycle, there was something about, and of course that the building was stormed by activists in the neighborhood once it went condo in the late 80s. It was stormed one night during the Tompkins Square Park riots. It was stormed, they stormed the lobby, shouting, "Daae yuppie scum." So, this fight about gentrification has been going on for so long. And so, there's just something about, and yet the building is a very large and very plain building. And I love the fact that, to me, it kind of took on in Gatsby, the billboard of the eyes, the doctor so-and-so, that just kind of, it's very impassive and almost godlike, and just kind of watches good and really horrible things happen, and doesn't really comment or intervene, but it's just these eyes through which time and events are watched. So, I think for me, again, I moved to the city in 91, and I am just so hopelessly, I have always said if the best present anyone could ever give me would be a time capsule, and it just to send me back in time in New York for one weekend. And then the whole question is, what year would it be, and where would I go that weekend? And I could plot this out for you to exactly what I do and where I'd go every night. And so, I think it's just very funny, the whole part of the book for me that was written in the 80s is, I don't know if it would sound like a very twisted thing to say that I have nostalgia for the 80s and for what happened in the gay community in the 80s. And I've thought about this a great deal and what I'm actually really trying to say when I say that. And I think that what I mean, and I've talked about this, I'm 48 now, and I've talked about this with, queer people and gay men even younger than me. And when we articulate it, it's that we wish that, we wished we had lived in a moment of such consequences. And would we have been heroes? Would we have really stepped to the occasion the way And, quite frankly, for me, the people who did were when I was in my 20s in the 90s, the people who did were my heroes, were my superheroes. The people who looked at the epidemic in the face, either as journalists or activists or caretakers, as opposed to the many, many people who, for different reasons, just went on living their lives in fashion or music or whatever. Those were my queer heroes when I was in my 20s, and it's what I aspire to. And I think that when I talk about my nostalgia for the 80s, for this decade when I wasn't in New York, that's really what I mean, because I think in some way, like, a lot of us yearn to live in a time of consequences where, like, our actions will really have consequences, where the choices we make will be really impactful. And now we're in that time.
Again.
Here we are.
I was startled to hear that from people that kind of desire to have been there. When How to Survive a Plague, the film came out 5 years ago, one of the first screenings we did, a young woman stood at a microphone and said how moved she was by it and how much she wished she were there. And I thought, I was shocked. I so much wish I wasn't there. And but I started to get it. I started to get.
But you also forget. When I was reading your book, we lived in the same building. In fact, he was telling me we lived in the same building. I'm like, oh my God, we're in the same building. But we were at the Christador, like we were there, and I think that you forget how much things change. It's so radical, right? How quickly things change, even when you're in it. And I don't think even. When I read your book, I remembered, oh my God, it was a shooting gallery to be in where I was living. It was a shooting gallery. It was not a happy place. There was incredible amount of drug addiction going on. It was very scary. Rats were everywhere.
It was skanky, yeah.
Mega rats like you don't see. And that's what I remember of the 80s. Like, we were living in this incredible rat city.
But there was that thing you were talking about. There's this sense of power that people, when they look back at that, especially people who are like, young, 40 years and younger, they see young people grabbing power. They see a history of young people, fighting and winning. And that sense of triumph and empowerment is striking a generation of people who don't feel power, who feel really powerless. And I think this Trump era has really underscored that for them. And I think that's why so many people are looking back at our 1980s.
That's why I wanted to. Can we turn this on you for a minute?
You can turn anything on me.
You're such a baby. How old are you?
I'm 28.
You're a baby.
What do you want to turn on me, though? What do you want to say?
Well, I'm curious. Like, have you in your lifespan as a young adult, have you felt that you were living in a time where there was something to step up to, and that you could? Do you feel that now? I feel like I could speak to what I see, but I'd rather hear it from someone.
I think that my generation, people around my age, probably, and we have data and stats to back this up, are more involved than ever and want to be more active, but also I think that the machinations of power above us have become more centralized and even harder to penetrate and change. And so it's probably a more it's like a revitalized generation that wants to do stuff, but I just think that it's a lot harder to change. Like, things have just become even more ensconced, and like the people who have power are holding onto it even more tightly, and the wealth disparities are even greater. And so when you don't have wealth, which my generation is very much lacking in wealth, it's harder to have the tools to create change. Like, we're further kind of marginalized, especially people of color, youth of color, queer youth of color in my generation are very much like further marginalized. So I think it's harder on our, even though there's more will, I would say, and the data and the stats show that like we are a civic-minded generation. I just think it's really hard on the other end to get things done.
I think always, my sense is when I look back, and I was thinking about this when I was looking at the show tonight, and also just how we write our histories, right? To some extent now we're narrating them. Like, I can look back and read my own diaries and see a certain narrative that emerged from it. a lot of what happened was was on the margins. And what I see now with Trump and in the queer communities, I see this extraordinary, just as I did in the 80s and 90s, extraordinary constant reinvention of creative expression, sense of identity, resistance, community building. And I don't necessarily think that we may name it today as being vital or transformative, groundbreaking, reflecting maybe a new paradigm, just as we didn't necessarily see that in the 90s or in the 80s. But when we look and see like that show tonight, and we see the work, we see it later, that it was that. And I see that now with Trump. I'm in California now, and particularly around, especially, I spend a lot of time looking at things in trans communities and what I consider to be the communities that are very impacted now by Trump's policies, immigrant communities, Muslim communities, younger undocumented communities. And I see a lot that I'm looking at and saying, this is going to be, we're going to look back at this in 10 years or 15 years and see that this is where the front line is. These are all the front lines. And let me see, for myself, I'm fascinated. I'm like, let me see who's emerging. What are they saying to each other? They're not necessarily aiming their focus at Washington or even at Trump or the cabinet. They're surviving. And I think that what we did in the 80s and we did in the 90s is a survival that defined new senses of community and new senses of empowerment. So I see a lot of similarities with that now in what I consider the millennials and even the below the millennials.
Gen Z.
Gen Z.
Gen Z is great. They're super queer.
Gen Z.
The majority of Gen Z identifies as somewhere other than a Kinsey zero.
Exactly.
One of the other things that I did that I think is different about our generation. So for me, I've never lived in a world without HIV being around. So for better or for worse, and I'm not like blaming prior generations. I think that's really short-sighted, but I think you're right. So like when it was happening, you were in it, and there was a lot of like energy around tackling this with ACT UP and whatnot. And then now some of those messages around like prevention or living with it are with our generation. And at the time, they may not have seemed outdated because you were just getting new information. But now some outdated ways of talking about HIV are like ensconced in the way the government or the CDC even talks about HIV, or the way older gay men talk to younger gay men about HIV. So it feels like we were raised with some messages that have kind of put us behind the eight ball in a lot of ways. Does that make sense?
Well, can you give an example?
I think I definitely okay. So when you were growing up, let's say because you were born before HIV became a thing, there was not the narrative of inevitability that eventually popped up as HIV came out, and then it was like, of course, you're saying, okay, the media narrative was that queer people are getting this, and so you're probably going to get this. But now I was raised and came out in a milieu where queerness and HIV were already inextricably linked, and I came out in a world where, like, I think I've told you this story. So, like, I came out to my mother, and the first thing she said was, like, don't get AIDS.
Yeah.
And so that's a world that a lot of us came out in, so it just feels different to, like, have that be the first thing your mother says to me. And background for not everyone who knows, my father was HIV positive and passed away from an AIDS-related illness in 2011, so that complicates the story because my mother was also married to an HIV positive man. So that's what I'm just saying is that, we were raised in a generation where, like, kind of our queerness was already associated with a fatal illness. Well, not a fatal illness, but in people's eyes.
I very much feel like I came of age with the two things being inextricably bound. I mean, I almost felt, and I think so many people my age and somewhat younger felt, that if to live an active gay life as a gay man, you would get it. I mean, in the early, and I was thinking about this earlier today, in the mid-90s, we weren't even sure that you couldn't get it from oral sex.
Right.
I mean, think of how little options that leaves you in terms of, like, what...
You almost choked on that.
What you... Not as much as I'd have liked. No, but I'm saying, I mean, I feel like as early as I was 11 in 1981, and
Right.
very much remember being in high school and seeing Rock Hudson on the cover of Time or People, and just feeling like I mean, that kept me in, maybe, who knows, in the closet. I mean, I came out of the closet at the end of college in like 90, but feeling very much like that's your fate if you come out as gay.
Right. And so then my only point, not that it's not that you didn't experience that, but that we came up in a world where that was already the case. Like Rock Hudson on the cover of whatever had already been there, and it had been people's imprint in their mind about HIV for years. And so it gets maybe sometimes harder to fight against that when it's been in the milieu
And it also,
for so
I mean,
long.
you're in a third generation of AIDS. There's a saturation. So people may have grown up with these very diffuse messages around HIV, and people kind of knowing this from the cradle on. That doesn't necessarily mean that any of the prevention messages are received in the same way that they are when you don't know what a disease is and you don't even know who's impacted and you're still learning it, and the entire country is on a
Right.
different kind of alert. I actually feel that it's very, very difficult now to do AIDS prevention work, to do even AIDS treatment work. And if we look at it, we're absolutely, I would say, failing on a profound level to deal with the class and the race issues in this country that are pushing this epidemic in our country right now. If you look at it, I mean, we have a raging opioid HIV epidemic that's impacting a lot of people of color, but a lot of white, younger white, unemployed people living in poverty, all these indices, and they're absolutely invisible. They're not even necessarily in our Pause magazines or something. They're not in our AIDS movement. They're not in the movement that we created out of a pretty queer identity. And so that's true. And in other countries, it might have been out of a queer identity, but you often have, in the places where I've done a lot of work in Africa and Rwanda and Uganda and stuff, I mean, it's much more of a national epidemic. It wasn't stigmatized the same way because they didn't have the history of having a queer movement or even a sexual liberation movement in the same way that they could have the same narratives.
Well, I think the thing that I want to add to that I wanted to bring up in a question somehow, but it was also about how the dominant narrative around ACT UP and the AIDS epidemic and the activism around it, the dominant media narrative from someone who consumes media around it, is that it was a white movement, and that's not the reality. And so there's a disconnect between the narrative and the reality. And so I think for a lot of queer people of color, they feel disinherited from the reality that they were a part of this from the beginning.
Yeah.
And so that there needs to be work done to unearth more work. I'm not going to discount the work that has been done. More work to be done to unearth the ways that people of color were part of these narratives.
And I think, again, I mean, we're doing a lot of that now. I saw it, with ACT UP, a lot of the people probably know about the Hidden Histories Conference that takes place and other narratives that are coming forward. People talk to me about my own book about the fact that they like the fact that lesbians and the stories of women and also Paris and Haitians and other countries, that the visibility of AIDS activism in a global context and the impact of ACT UP in the US on these other movements is visible because they're not familiar with it. But I think it's also, when I talk about it here, like I have never seen the history of AIDS in Haiti written. I hope someday it gets written. It's going to be a remarkable history, but it's going to be something very difficult to write because it was such a stigmatized illness. People didn't identify that way. If people are not even visible to each other, it's hard to write a history of it. So I'm saying that there's reasons why and all that. So we have a lot of stories to tell that haven't been said, but it's not going to be the same kind of narrative at all.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm sure we have. Well, I was going to say 3 journalists. I guess we have 4 journalists on the stage, but and we're all in this space. I'm sure you've all read America's Hidden HIV Epidemic by Linda Villarosa, which is an instance of that work kind of being done. And it was just, have people here read that piece that was in the New York Times Magazine? Like, it needs a clap. Thank you for clapping, because it was just amazing. And
It was, just in the New York Times Magazine like a month ago? Or
yeah,
6
like
weeks
a month
ago?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. Oh, I guess I have more questions. I don't know. How are we doing on time? I don't know. Okay. So I did want to talk about, in each of your works, this is actually a really good playoff of talking about community, and I would love to hear David talk about this too, as someone who's taken the same, an amount of material and made both a visual and a written work from it. How do you balance that need to portray the epidemic as one that affected so many communities, and there were swaths of communities involved in the activism as well, versus the very narrative, literary idea of like having a main character and telling a story with like 8 characters so that people aren't overwhelmed and they don't feel like they're reading War and Peace or Anna Karenina or something like that, you know? So
Right.
how do you balance that?
Well, it was certainly a different challenge for the film than it was for the book. In the film, and I had never made a film before, so it took me a while to try to learn the language of cinema and how that storytelling is done. And I knew that I couldn't tell the story of the plague in a 90-minute documentary. And I was further hampered by the idea that I was making the film based on this, so-called found footage. This archival footage shot by, in the end, 33 different unrelated cinematographers, and to compile what they saw and what they found interesting and what they saved and was preserved over the years into a single story meant that I was not really the director in that way. I wasn't directing those cameras. And so the stories in the documentary are the stories that I was able to tell. So that was limited by that ability. And I wanted to go back and look at that period without that restriction. And that's why I went back to the book. And so I was able to change the narrative. The book really tells a different story than the documentary does. And it is a broader
Including your story.
Including my story. But it's a broader story about the plague in America. And so it gave me the opportunity to expand and to tell the stories of the way what began as a kind of a white, gay male disease of privilege in the early parts of the epidemic, and certainly for the first 30% of my book, that's where it's burning the brightest. But then just to watch as it moves, to watch as it moved to other communities, and to watch how those other communities reacted to it. And when watch characters arrive for the first time in the middle of the book. We don't see Peter Staley, for example, who is the star of the documentary. We don't see him until well into the third quarter of the book. So I still wasn't able to tell everything. It's just not possible to tell everything. So it's frustrating always when you're trying to tell a history to know that you can't put it all in.
I have a final question because we have to move to audience questions, and I'm probably not even supposed to ask this final question, but I want to know, in like 1 or 2 sentences, what is, in your imagination, what's a story about HIV or AIDS that you want to hear told or see told by someone?
I was just sparked by what you were saying earlier. The first report of AIDS was right before the July 4th weekend, 1981. 41 people, homosexuals, had been diagnosed with a rare cancer. One of those people was African American. So right from the very start, we have this a disease that's not an entirely white disease. Nobody knows who that guy is or what happened to him. I would love to see a narrative like that, to find an unlikely person's narrative through this epidemic and find what that would teach us about opening up the rest of this history.
Do you know what I would love?
What would you love? I would love to know.
I was actually thinking about this just the other day. I don't know if there's an organization that started in Atlanta called Sister Love, which is, it's HIV/AIDS support group for Black women, and the woman who started it, Daae Dixon Diallo, I was talking to her or someone at the agency just a few weeks ago or something for a story, and the community of support that she created for Black, mainly heterosexual women in and around Atlanta who found out they were diagnosed. And I mean, partly like why I wanted to tell the story of Isabel Mendez is because in all these years of reporting, the stories from women have been very moving to me because they often got diagnosed in a vacuum. Like they were not living in a community where it was already kind of part of the community and quasi-accepted and there was a place to go. It was like no one in their lives. And this woman Daae Dixon Diallo, as the rates of, as infection rates started climbing in hetero black women, she started this agency, this support agency, that's very focused around like sisterhood and self-esteem and being there for each other. And I think that would be like, you could tell that in a very dry way, or that could be like a mini series, like that could be like a really beautiful heart. It could be like an Oxygen mini series.
I would love to cast Daae on so much.
Oh my God, right?
I love her. Go ahead.
I think I have a long list. I mean, I think in the U.S., I remain very interested in the story of hemophiliacs and HIV. When I was in Paris, as people know, I spent a lot of time with deaf HIV ACT UP activists, and I think the journey of the deaf and HIV is it's compelling, so compelling. I am very moved because I've been in the global context a lot, as people know, and when I was in Paris, I did spend quite a bit of time in clinics, and these were early 90s, and I did run into a lot of Muslim women, young Muslim women who were dying of AIDS, and I don't think we know anything about their deaths. I don't even know that we can appreciate the intersection of what I think of as colonialism, stigma, gender, and I just feel like there are more stories than we can even look at. Haiti is another case in point. Before I came to the Native, I was reporting in Haiti, and there were people dying of acute tuberculosis, and of course, in retrospect, later people went back and figured out those were all HIV, became HIV deaths, GRID, and these stories are still not told, and they're very much the part of the U.S. epidemic too. So, I mean, there's more stories that I see than can be told right now, and the final one for me would be the trans stories. I feel like we have not done our work. We do not know who died of AIDS in the trans community in the United States, and we should try to bring out their stories and their lives.
Does anyone in the audience have a question for any of our lovely panelists? So there's one and then two over here. We'll do in that order.
I really want to thank the panel. Thank you.
Yeah, there's people watching, or we're recording, so we're going to use a microphone.
Okay, yeah, I really want to thank the panel. There's been a lot of important ideas put out, and my name is Bob Lederer. I was in ACT UP from 1988 to 2000, and also an editor at PAUSE from 95 to 2000. I want to pick up on what Mathew and Tim and Christine in particular highlighted about the communities whose role in AIDS activism has been hidden and often deliberately obscured and omitted, particularly women, people of color, current and former drug users, and people throughout the global South. And that's something that, of course, the major corporate media, we're not going to expect them to ever portray those stories, but it becomes particularly disappointing when one of our own, like David France, produces a movie and more egregiously a 600-page book that doesn't mention that there was this powerful Latino caucus of ACT UP for 5 years that did incredible actions for that community, that barely talks about the role of the Majority Action Committee, that highlighted issues of people of color, that the Women's Caucus is kind of relegated to a footnote, that Neil Exchange is hardly mentioned, et cetera. And so that's one of the reasons that we in ACT UP and a queer show on WBAI Radio held a conference last month about the hidden histories, and I just wanted to announce that we're also now going to be doing an online archive of hidden histories of AIDS activism, and we welcome any of you to contribute your memorabilia and narratives and materials to make sure that there is a visibility, there is a record, and that it's not just kind of a monochromal view of the heroic activism that saved millions of lives around the world.
Do you want to respond, David?
Hi, Bob. How are you? Well, I already said what I did in the movie. But the book has never been intended to be about ACT UP. It's not a book about ACT UP. It's a book about the plague and the journey that I witnessed through it, and it's principally, as you know, and we've spoken about this before, about the development of protease inhibitors. That's the thread that pushes this treatment thread that starts from page 1 and goes to the very last page of the book. And I welcome every other historian and writer and journalist and novelist to make that account richer. I know there have been some very important books written about ACT UP that detail all the various structures of the organization and what was accomplished there, that book especially. And they're very helpful for historians and for instructors for teaching. That was not the book that I intended to make. So my book is flawed in many ways, and I knew that as I was finishing it. But it is purely the book that I set out to write.
Hi, my name is Alfredo Gonzalez. I'm one of the Latinos of ACT UP who are now 20-something years later. We're thinking about the past and trying to build a narrative. So I have a question for the four of you that is a little bit building up on what Bob and Mathew have mentioned about narrating or talking about a story in which you were part, so to speak, from the periphery. And you know, I'm just using terms, and I'm not being really precise about the terminology I'm using. So in writing this story in which we were not at the center of it, we have questions about, for example, how do we evaluate our story in comparison to how the central story is evaluated. In all of this, we have we've come to an agreement. We understand that actually, we believe that the personal is political, and we are completely convinced of that. So we're beginning to try to think about these stories through our own personal experiences, through the subjective. And my question is, goes to the four of you, but particularly to Mathew and Christine. How does the subjective can be worked out to inform what will be taken as objective, or how the subjective can inform a chronicle, when I push it, I make it richer, because that's what I'm going to. You know, what is it that when we talk from the margins, we add that enriches the central narrative?
Well, I mean, I think that what you're pointing at is like one of the central questions that people always raise about journalism, right? Is like, should journalists be 100% objective and things like that? And that's, I think each of us here hopefully would say that there's a difference between being objective and being fair, like reporting the ways things happen is not the same as being 100% objective. Mm-hmm. And there's a long history, there's a long history among Latinos of like testimonio as a literary tradition, the tradition of just having people tell their stories. And that's exactly how a lot of indigenous Latinos were able to have their stories told and to understand. So I think, especially for something like the Latino Caucus, like, you know, we shouldn't think of objectivity in the goal when it comes to HIV activism. I think it should be amplifying, which is taking voices that are on the periphery, which is the word you used, and just kind of recentering, like relooking the way we're looking at the sphere and bringing them more to the center for a moment. But, you know, also reporting it out and making sure that the person, you know, lived where they said they lived at one point or whatever, not like taking it as fact, but, you know, having an agenda does not mean that you're not being fair or you're not doing the right job. I think it's important, especially for Latinos, that we embrace that history of like speaking from the mouth as a way of telling our story.
I think also, I mean, we've been educated to realize that that our reality is ours and we come with all of our biases. And I think especially when, as journalists, I feel we are asked often to tell the stories of other people or to have the opportunity, the privilege that we have to have access to a media or to interview someone. I mean, for me at this point, I'm very, very attentive to my own biases. I feel like my own biases interest me. They usually reflect dominant culture biases often, or information, everything from where I'm going to choose my sources. I do feel often drawn to the stories of people who don't get as much access. That's always going to interest me. But I feel as a kind of a feminist and as a sort of sensitive person that I'm very careful now to say what's my story and what's not my story, and what is my best use with my privilege that I have to see how whatever this experience or event is to be told. And I feel that now with HIV and AIDS, that I think about that a lot. And if anything, right now, I have moved completely 360 degrees away from how I felt about journalism when I started out. I don't feel any journalism is objective at all, at all. I feel like everything about what we do is subjective, and it's good. What I care about and what I did a lot in the Pox Lover was to try to see how I was connected to things in order to understand what even my gaze is. And I feel that now when I'm reporting, like, I'm starting to write about ISIS, and a subject that I find very difficult. And what I care about is even how did I receive the look that I have on this subject? What does it say about me and how I look at it? And I feel like, if anything, I have responsibility to try to turn it around. So in my own journalism now, and in my own, what do you want to call it, history writing, documentation, observation, analysis, it's equally important to me to be super conscious of my privilege and to work with that as something that I use to examine whatever I'm looking at that I think might be outside of me, knowing that it is not outside of me, knowing that I am connected to it, and how I'm connected is rich, and that I have to turn the mirror on myself just as much as whatever it is I'm looking at, if that makes sense.
And I think one of the great things that you brought up is that, there's that famous quote that, like, if you stay neutral in situations of injustice, you're siding with the oppressor. I think about that when I think about objectivity. Like, often what people, uplift and put on a pedestal as objectivity often means siding with the oppressor. And so, like, that's not something that I'm interested in. And so that's not something that I would carry over into my work,
I guess for me it's saying that the questions that we're asking ourselves are a departure point.
Correct.
To say, what is it that I'm even, like, what is this problem? How am I even defining this problem? And what does that say about me as much? Because I think that informs everything about how we write.
Right. We have time for one more brief question, and this was the first hand that was up. So,
Alex.
One brief question. And then, of course, we'll be around to schmooze with once we get off the stage and there's no different power differential.
To follow up on your question, I wanted to think about the show. So one of the things, you've all seen it upstairs, and one of the things that I think is so magnificent about what's happening in that show, and a lot of curating and programming right now in New York City, is that, and my hat's off to Stephen, I don't know where you are, but that people are starting to, those of us programming, those of us whose work is being shown, to see this much more rich and complex blend, looking back at history, where the vital center light of gay white men shines in conversation with a lot of the other work. Some of my work is in the show, a lot of the other work that was happening at that time, and a lot of the other communities that were impacted, and the real intersections and dynamism of that moment. So I'm wondering if you all could reflect on the response to your question as seen in the show upstairs.
I mean, I would say that I spoke to the curator that it was made me very sad to see the show. Actually, I mean, I was kind of hit, wasn't really expecting to see it, thinking about that before I was here, and that it made clear something that all of us know, which is that one lives, whether it's an epidemic or a war or a disease or in one's body, so personally and so privately. And it is political and it is collective, but what upstairs I felt was I really saw that. And also the ordinariness of this. It's just like a war can be ordinary. It's an ordinariness. And all of the small objects that I saw I like that it brought us so close to that, and also that it showed the forms of resistance that we take that we may not consider resistance at that moment, but just show our heart. So for me, it was a sad. It hit me, and I decided to have a glass of champagne after. Actually, that's my response to try to relive myself. But it's a beautiful show. It's moving, and I want to see so much more of it. But I really love the intimacy. I feel like AIDS remains. It was HIV. Diseases are so intimate. How we live it was intimate. The parts of your book that I appreciate almost the most were the most intimate pieces. It's an incredibly intimate battle that we're still in.
I think one thing I was thinking about when I was looking at the show that it's always kind of struck me as weird and fascinating and creepy about New York in the 80s was that in the midst of this raging epidemic, life still went on. Art went on, commerce went on, fashion, just music. The idea that those other channels of the 80s were playing out along with the epidemic, and and that it affected so many artists, and so that maybe in one year, Keith Haring, in 1988, 1989, he's making tons of work. In 1990, he's dead. Just the smash, just the art and life and the vitality of the city, right up against this. That you might be at someone's opening one night and at someone's funeral the next night is, for me, not having been here during that, I just so badly want to know what that felt like, especially for young people, maybe but this is going back to what we were talking about, just the intensity, the extremity of the experience, and especially if you're in your 20s or 30s, I can't.
But think about right now. Every day we open the newspaper and we see another revelation of who was at that fucking Russia-Trump meeting. And that's it.
I don't think it's the same thing, though, because it's not attacking you from within.
It's not affecting our bodies. But
Yeah.
what I mean is the sense of what turns from, you still want to have incredulity every day, and it moves so quickly to this new normal. And the speed of that, the speed with which you take something that you cannot accept, and it is there, and now it is being treated, and in fact, you're going to go out dancing the next day because, of course, you have to go dancing. That's not different from, it's on a macro level, and yes, people are living disease, but I still feel like it's like what we're doing now. We're looking at things saying, this is so wrong, and yet, here it is.
But well, listen, I wasn't there. It just doesn't seem to me that they're quite the same thing.
David, do you want to?
I wasn't there.
Well, I will. I will say the same thing. I haven't seen the show upstairs, but as I said before, I lived AIDS at home. So, one of the things that eventually I want to write in a memoir about my father is that he was diagnosed while my mother was pregnant. So he was newly diagnosed and understanding his life while I was just starting to crawl. So I think that when I heard the name AIDS at Home, I was like, well, that's me. So, yeah.
But as you said in your piece, you didn't learn until much
I
later
didn't learn
in
until
life
much
that he
later,
died of
and I
AIDS,
actually
right?
am in some ways very thankful for that too. It's it became such a no-brainer. It's growing up, I took baths with my father. I did everything that are those things that were stigmatized about being with people with HIV, sharing food and forks and living spaces and showering the way that young kids shower with their parents and blah, 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 and did all that growing up with someone who was HIV positive. And it was later on when I found out that was what was happening, it was it was a gift to me that I was able to understand that. Yeah.
And you, I should note, have a beautiful essay about this online that you wrote for The Body, right?
I have a few. I don't
Yeah.
know which ones. No, not they're all beautiful.
I meant the beautiful one.
The beautiful one. I have a beautiful essay about dating. I have a beautiful essay about dating HIV-positive men coming out in a book next year.
Excellent.
So look forward to that. It's called the book is called Modern Loss. So I have an essay about that in my book.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's give a round of applause to everyone who's here.
Curator, thank you.
I just wanted to take a second just personally to thank all of our panelists, and I hope you will come back to see the exhibit. I hope you'll join us to keep talking. Thank you all for being here. And again, please join me in thanking these 4 amazing journalists and authors. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.